Good morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are you doing? Good morning, Mac. How's it going?
Good morning. I'm good. How are you?
I am very good, thank you. Do you know what? I was just realizing it's not Fridays, it's Thursday.
It's definitely not Friday, but it does feel like one.
It does, doesn't it? It's Thursday. So I normally do these on a Friday for anybody that joins, but I'm traveling tomorrow, and so we're doing this today because this is my commitment to show up weekly, at least weekly, here on LinkedIn, doing these LinkedIn lives. I think you do something similar, Mac, at the Equal Group. I mean, you do webinars and stuff, don't
We,
you?
we do webinars. Yeah.
Yeah,
I've not done one for a while, I must confess.
yeah,
The team's kind of been taking that mantle.
yeah.
And I I do want to quietly make a commitment to be more present on LinkedIn, but I've just not managed to do so. So this is my easing back into it, I guess.
Well, you've just made it public. So anybody that's listening, Max said he's gonna be more active
But to
on
be to be fair, I said it as part of my New Year's resolution as well, which I kept up for about 2 weeks.
LinkedIn. So, Mac, it's really good to have you on here. If anybody doesn't know, I can't believe that there's anybody that might be tuning in that doesn't know who Mac is. Mac is founder and CEO at Equal Group, the data-driven DE&I consultancy. I did that off memory. Can you believe
I'm
that?
impressed. I'm impressed.
So that marketing and that strap line has really worked. Do you want to just, before we get into the conversation, just explain, I guess, your motivation for starting the Equal Group?
Yeah, definitely. So I come from a background in the energy sector, so I spent 10 years as a regulatory consultant. I'm an economist by training, but a lot of my work in the energy sector was focused on helping leadership teams to understand the regulatory landscape, looking out into the future, so 5, 10, 15 years, understanding what would change and understanding what needed to change today in order for organizations to make the most of their position. Um, Invariably, I spent a lot of my time in boardrooms, a lot of my time in industry events and conferences and cross industry collaboration sessions, and was just struck by the lack of diversity in the room. At first, I thought it was something that would naturally change over time as the industry diversified. Entry level positions were becoming more diverse, but that just didn't filter through to the top. So, towards the end of my tenure, I started having more conversations with leaders that I had built up a good relationship with, mainly to see whether they saw the issue as I did, or whether I was being hypersensitive to it. They did see the issue but didn't necessarily know what to do about it. I think a lot of that cohort was male, middle-aged, middle class, able-bodied, heteronormative, and therefore didn't feel equipped necessarily to talk about diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that I definitely realized was that there was such a power in data. I think there was a large gap in terms of visibility from a data perspective, both quantitative and qualitative. But then also data gives you the power to really talk about the data, the observations, without necessarily the sensitivities and the emotion that comes with that.
Yeah.
So that was essentially the kind of brainchild for the Equal Group. And since then, kind of 5 years ago now, we've been working with organizations to transform the way that they see their problems and provide solutions to hopefully improve their diversity and inclusion outcomes.
Amazing. And that's a great kind of like lead into the conversation, right? So first of all, so Joanne Conway said that she's going to be watching out for your posts, Max. So
Definitely
you
put me
better
on the spot there.
you better get crafting those posts. But part of what I like about your story, and I can't even remember how long ago it was that I kind of came across the Equal Group, but I love the fact, as you say, you've got this rationale for why you're so data driven and why that sort of sits at the heart of the business. And obviously, what we're talking about today is how to choose a DE&I consultancy. Now, when this went out as an event on LinkedIn, there were a few comments, and I know DE&I as a profession sometimes gets a little bit of a hard time. Actually, it's fair to say, and I think certainly of late. And so I just want to make it clear that this is not going to be the shade borough, right? So there's going to be no shade, no tea on this.
Are you sure? I don't think you can make that promise in advance, but we'll see.
So it's not going to be any shade. We are going to just sort of talk about this topic in terms of D&I consultants. what have been some of the success stories, Mac, Sophia is answering? Do you want to answer that now? What have been some of your biggest success stories as a consultancy?
I think for me, it's really about when we can use data to transform the way an organization sees diversity and inclusion. And kind of one of the comments you just made in that introduction, Shoal, is kind of diversity and inclusion often gets a bad rap. Um, I think it's actually improved. I think if we kind of rewind to post George Floyd and post Me Too, there was definitely this perspective or perception that diversity and inclusion was airy fairy, and it didn't really, kind of woo woo kind of as a subject matter,
Yeah,
didn't really have an impact, didn't really have any commercial benefits to an organization. I think that's changed
yeah,
slightly. I think so. I say that to say some of the success stories has really been where we've managed to um, center organizations and make sure that they have full visibility of kind of what their main gaps are within the organization, and then be proactive around solutioning. So our offering is both in terms of visibility, but also in terms of helping organizations, partnering with
yeah,
organizations to transform the way they do business. One that
yeah,
really sticks out is a kind of management consultancy that we work with that were initially really resistant to diversity and inclusion,
yeah,
and that was coming from the most senior leadership in that organisation.
mm,
And we presented the data in such a way that it kind of, so when we look at data, we look at both qualitative and quantitative. And the qualitative data is often a little bit more powerful because that's where people get to tell their stories. And there was a young lady working in that organisation that said that she really enjoyed her job, wanted to progress in her career, but also wanted to have a family. And given kind of the workload and the way that work was structured,
mm,
the way the work kind of often involved long hours, traveling. She felt that she couldn't do both, so there'd come at a natural time where she'd have to choose between her kind of private life and her career. And that's something that the most senior leader in the organization looked at and said, look, this is a really easy thing for us to fix through implementing flexible working, through making um, clearer parental policies. Let's get to grips with this and let's fix it now. And very quickly, the policies were changed. Very quickly, there was a focus on kind of making sure that people didn't necessarily have to feel that they had to choose between their career and their personal lives.
mm. Good, 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 good. And Sophia followed it with another question, which was, "Have you seen transformational sustained change?" So I'm guessing that's probably a really good example that you've given there. The management.
I've got yeah, I've got another as well, which is
Go on
an
then, Matt.
organization we've worked with for probably about 3 or 4 years now, and they looked at kind of their diversity and inclusion environment, looked at the way that they did things internally as well as externally. So for context, they're a both an employer and a trade union. And they set up a diversity and inclusion committee, which was kind of reporting to the board, which was the same way you'd get kind of audit committee, same way you'd get remuneration committee, set up a
Mm,
diversity and inclusion committee that is now part and parcel of how they do business, with the remit to look both internally and externally. And for me, that was transformational in terms of like this is the level of seriousness with which we understand this issue, but also looking forward to the future to say this will constantly be a focus.
yeah, brilliant. Perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the comments, Sophia. So Sophia said absolutely change the head, change the dread. That's one that I haven't heard in this space, but I love it. Excellent examples. Thank you. So let's get into the conversation about how to choose a D&I consultancy. And we're going to start with, everyone knows I always like starting with the facts and figures. There are a lot of D&I consultants, and I certainly don't have the figures in terms of how many. But one thing I wanted to do, I wanted to just maybe put Mac on the spot a little bit and see how many different types of D&I consultancies we could come up with. So let's just talk, as we go into this conversation, what are the types of DE&I consultants that are out there? So when people are thinking about this as an area, what's out there first, and then we'll get to the organization itself and what it might need and how it matches up to what's out there.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because I think there's probably a couple of dimensions to look at it through. So
Mm,
one is kind of structure, one is focus, and when I say structure, it's more about how is the organization structured as a consultancy or as consultant. So you've got everything from a one-person band to I wouldn't say there's many that have more than kind of 40 organizations and 40 individuals working for that organization.
Yeah.
I'd say there's also something about the model as well. So we as an organization have decided to employ our consultants full time. So you won't necessarily find associates working for us as kind of a rule of thumb, whereas you've got other organizations that are structured in a way that they've got kind of a core team of three to five, and then a network of associates. The reason that we've decided not to go down the associate route is because we can't necessarily guarantee consistency, quality, and then there's also something there about retained knowledge. So we want to make sure as much as possible we're retaining knowledge, we're retaining the ability to learn lessons and to evolve and to continue to improve. There's also something about the difference in terms of focus. So you've got organizations or individuals that focus on a specific protected characteristic or a specific level of intervention. So people that specialize in leadership versus kind of a broader brush approach. And again, I think we as an organization focus intersectionally. So we look at all protected characteristics and kind of all issues that kind of encompass diversity and inclusion.
And that's, if I could just stop on that one in particular, the focus one, because I think that's certainly for me, that's the one that really sort of like rings a bell. And often when you're on LinkedIn, I think we're getting more clarity now, but I would say certainly sort of like post 2020 and post George Floyd, I think there were a lot of DE&I consultants that were actually very, very, very focused, as in, for example, anti-racism training or LGBTQ awareness or disability inclusion. And I think it's I've certainly seen over the last, I would maybe say 18 months, where it's starting to become clearer. And I think the language that we're starting to use makes it easier for organizations to realize, okay, that consultancy only does that particular protected characteristic, or that one, in terms of, as you sort of said, they're more intersectional, as in they look across. Is that something you'd agree with?
I think so. And I think when I look back kind of 4 or 5 years ago, there were a lot of assumptions made. I know that I've walked into rooms or have walked into rooms previously to talk about diversity and inclusion. Everybody assumes as a black man, I'm made to talk about ethnicity and race. And part of that narrative is explaining what we do, how we do it. And the fact that our view personally is that you can't necessarily look at any of these things individually, because if you look at just race, there will be individuals from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities that also are women, or also have disabilities, or also carers or parents, and you can't necessarily just isolate their race as a fundamental issue without looking holistically at the other issues that impact them.
Okay, cool. I think we'll probably come back to that then, in terms of when is it appropriate to use some of those consultants that do focus on like those individual characteristics, you know what I mean, as opposed to sort of across the piece. So interestingly, I like the way that you broke it down in terms of the different types of consultants. You talked about structure, focus, the model. Was there anything more about the model that you wanted to, Sarah, have you covered that? Was that to do like the associate model?
So I think the model is really important. I think one of the things that we often look at within that model dynamic is bandwidth. So you sometimes got kind of again, it depends on the size of organization, the level of interventions that are needed. Sometimes there's limited bandwidth within the team, which is why people do leverage that associate model and kind of bring people on as and when needed. I think there's also something to be said about approach. And one of the things that I observe in this market, and it'd be great to get your views on as well, is that there are individuals or organizations that are kind of more activist leaning, which is, I think, about identifying problems, identifying issues. And then there's organizations that are probably the other end of the spectrum, which is more about resolutions and interventions and making sure that there is some improvement. So I think it's kind of that issue finding versus issue solving
Yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah, I love that. And we'll probably get into that, I think, when we talk about like the fit as well, because definitely where somebody is on the spectrum in terms of activism, how militant they are, as I sometimes say, is definitely something to consider. Some really good questions coming in, actually. So Sophia sort of said, surely there are key foundational factors that go across. And I'm assuming she means across, for example, I think that's when we were talking about like the focus and whether there are key foundational factors that go across. I think we kind of say that there are, but I guess when you're looking at it more intersectionally or more holistically, you're almost like looking across the whole piece. Whereas if somebody's just focusing into one protected characteristic, whether that be disability or race or religion, then they're working more just in that niche. But there are going to be elements that go across all of them, right? Would you agree with that, Mac?
I think the question's phrased superbly, so well done, Sophia. I think you're right in terms of that those foundations being
Yeah.
transferable to some extent. But I think when you start to look at the nuance and when you start to think about what differentiates um, a policy or an intervention that improves things from a race perspective, from a policy or intervention that improves things from a disability perspective,
Yeah.
there's a lot of nuance in that, and really understanding those different communities and also the intersections that lie at the heart of that can hopefully improve your outcomes when crafting interventions.
Yeah, that's quite. I mean, that is quite a big question there. Actually, just in that small question, Sophia, there's actually quite a lot to unpack. Yeah, because even within the protected characteristics, there are lots of differences. Even so, if I were to think
Absolutely.
of, for example, religious belief, religious beliefs and the protection around that, different different beliefs, different religions are facing different challenges, and then you've also got things like other sorts of like philosophical beliefs, like being vegan. Things around now, even like gender critical theory. It's actually quite complex, even within the protected characteristics. But you are definitely right that there are foundational elements that go across. And then a really, really interesting question here from Kathy May. Is race central though? So even if you're looking intersectionally, or if you're looking at intersectionality, is race at the center? Mac, I'm going to throw that one straight over to you. And I don't know, Kathy May, whether you're saying almost like, I don't want to say priority, but there's something about, I don't know. Mac, let me throw it over to you, just literally as it's written.
It's very, very generous of you to throw it over to me. Really difficult question to answer, actually. Is it central? I think race for me has the most nuance in it, just based on, again, I might be going off a tangent here, but going off of kind of historic legacy. And when we think about things from a global perspective, and we think about transatlantic slave trade, for example, with race being at the heart of a lot of the theories and ideologies that were embedded into culture globally in order to justify things like the transatlantic slave trade. We then see a lot of the issues that we face in society as direct offshoots from that.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it's got 400 plus years of embedding into ideology, the way that we see things, the way that we do things, even as organizations and as society generally. I think it's also one of the easier things for people to misunderstand,
Mm-hmm.
because unless you have that lived experience, you probably would have never thought about race. I had a conversation with one of my colleagues about 3 or 4 years ago now, just about when was the first time you were aware of race or thought about race, and he grew up in Kent and didn't necessarily acknowledge or appreciate, and this is 50, 60 plus years ago, didn't necessarily appreciate or realize that there were different races. And first time he saw somebody of different ethnicity was, I think, when he was about 13 or 14. Contrast that with my first interaction of race, which was 4 years ago in the playground when somebody commented on the color of my skin. So there's that tendency for people not necessarily to reflect on or consider race if they don't have that lived experience.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Kathy. Man, I kind of wish we had longer to unpack it. Maybe that's part two. Maybe we'll bring Mac back on to talk about it because it's really interesting. Um, you almost don't want to talk. You don't want to talk about, for example, a hierarchy of protected characteristics and or challenges or issues or level of discrimination. Um, but I think what Kathy May's saying is quite interesting, and I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but there is something about the fact that certainly in most parts of the Western world, we do tend to see a lot through race. That's a lot of the construct. I'm not sure it will always be like that, but that certainly is where we are. So I can understand why that would be a possible sort of way of seeing things, that race is central because actually that's kind of how things have been organized for a long time. So let's have a look at what Sophia's got here. I would suggest power, fear, and self play a part with specific reference to foundational factors. This is a brilliant discussion. Thank you, Sophia. Sophia, we need to get you on here at some stage. Kathy May, thank you both for the way you're addressing this. Race seems to be the most challenging issue that really stops people from addressing DE&I. There's a lot of whataboutery. Yeah, I totally agree. We could talk about that, Fred. Do you know what's really interesting? When Kathy May asked that question in terms of is race central, and as you're answering, Mac, and there is, I mean, I was saying to a client last week, I think conversations about race are probably the most difficult, even though most people and most organizations want to absolutely do the right thing and move it forward. The conversations about race are really, really difficult. They're probably the trickiest. However, I would say closely followed by LGBTQ plus, because I still think that there is a level of bias and prejudice that is almost like uncool to vocalize, but it's still there. So that's the one reason why. And the second reason is I think what we also haven't really worked through it's the potential clashing and conflict of rights around freedom of religious thought and belief, when that kind of appears to almost be in opposition to LGBTQ plus rights. And through all of the digging around that I've done, I can't find any answers yet. There's a few cases around it, but we tend to just tiptoe around it and sort of dance around it sort of politely. But that those to me are some of the trickiest areas. But that's just my thoughts, and particularly with obviously the explosion now of gender identity and all of those things as well. So it's fascinating. We're 23 minutes in. We've hardly even gotten to the topic that we're covering. This is a really good conversation, Mac. Let's get into where I guess the organisation should start in terms of figuring out what it is that they need. So obviously, Mac, I feel like you're the right person to be talking about this, right? Because you're the data-driven data consultancy. How do organisations figure out what it is that they need?
Yes, it's a really good question. It's probably a good link back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of when is it right to contract with a specialist organisation or not. For us, and again, I'm going to be super biased in this answer, but I think you have to start with the data. So being being open to understand kind of where you are, what the challenges are, kind of either in terms of representation, visibility, progression, performance management to some extent. If you've got a certain demographic or intersection that is leaving the organization at a disproportionate rate to others, those are all key indicators that you've got some real issues or challenges. The overarching challenge in that response is that actually a lot of organizations generally don't have that data, and that's where an organization like ourselves come in terms of helping you get a good amount of visibility in terms of that data, and then moving from there to see actually is it a general issue across the business, is it specific department, is it at leadership level, is it in a specific region or office or location, is it with regards to a specific protected characteristic or intersection. And I think just being informed by the data is something that is essentially the approach that most organizations take in
Yeah.
most areas. So if you look at finance, for example, being switched on to whether you've got a problem with revenue, whether it's a problem with increasing costs, whether it's specific to a specific department or service line or time of the year, or just being led by your data really is something that organizations should be used to, but it's
Yeah.
interesting. I was going to say it's weird, but it's interesting that that the organizations don't necessarily have the same view when it comes to diversity and inclusion. It's kind of like we need somebody to come in and tick a box for us, so we're going to go with the cheapest provider,
Yeah.
and that's not always or I'd say it's never the right approach to take. But
Yeah. Absolutely. And starting with data, sometimes the data is, I almost feel sometimes the effort to collect the data is almost seen as a little bit of a stalling tactic, right? Because sometimes actually they know what the issue is, and the data then confirms. And I always say as well, especially for organisations that maybe are thinking that they haven't got the budget, I always say just start with the data that you've already got anyway. So if you've already been
yeah,
if you've already been surveying, even if you've cut it by gender or another demographic, you've already got a little bit of insight, albeit it may not get you to the root cause of some of the issues. That's where you can get Mac in or somebody else to kind of help to do that bit first. But yeah, absolutely look at maybe what data you've got already to kind of figure out what the issues are. So Joanne,
I'm very disgruntled that you said Mac or somebody else. I think
oh,
it's,
Mac and the equal group, of course.
absolutely.
So Joanne said here, I think understanding our own social identity and how that shapes your experiences at work and how that may be different for people with different identities to you are critical. For me, self-understanding is key. It's more likely that genuine action and systemic change can happen. Yeah, absolutely. That really resonated with the conversation that we were having off camera before we jumped on around, I guess, the sorts of individuals actually that are potentially well suited to go into this work, and it does link to
Yeah.
social identity and the experiences you've been through.
I think just to kind of add to Joan's
Yeah,
point, I
sure.
think the really interesting thing that I found, it'd be great to get your view of this as well, is that you've got a mold of leaders that have led for 20, 30 years. I come from an energy sector background, and it's it's unheard of to really go into that level of introspection to understand how your social identity or the way that you view yourself is or appears or kind of operates in the work environment, because you've gone 20, 30 years just not necessarily having to think about it. And I think only recently we've started to see the need for a new type of leader. And I think a lot of leaders are finding that adjustment quite difficult in terms of how do you show up authentically, how do you really get to grips with who you are, and how you encourage other people to be themselves or to bring their whole
Yeah,
self to work, when previously it was very much this is work, this is home, and the two
yeah,
never collide.
yeah. And I think also, and I say this quite a lot, even there's a great piece of work which I'm sure you've come across, Mac, and I know some of the people that are on will have come across, called Covering, which is around the fact that people
Yeah,
don't bring their whole selves to work. And I always think one of the really interesting findings of that piece of work is that everybody does it, even straight white men, right?
yeah,
So there is something about, even as you're saying, Mac, those leaders that have maybe been in businesses for 20, 30 years, playing this role that we sort of saw in the 80s and 90s. It's the version of leadership that kind of looks a bit like Donald Trump, if I put it
yeah,
like that, right? And they've been really used to playing that role. And actually, I always say one of the benefits of this work, of inclusion work, is actually they don't need to come to work and pretend to be a Donald Trump, right? They can come to work and just be themselves. So there's massive benefits, even for, as you say, those leaders that have maybe played that role in terms of their own social identity, that actually they can take that mask off as well. But then there is also the then bit of them understanding that for people with other social identities, the mask and the burden is even heavier, right?
yeah.
Because of all of the additional discrimination and the burden and all of that stuff. So, yeah, gosh, we're going in deep today, Mac. We're really getting in
Good,
deep.
good, good, good. These are like the type of conversations I like.
Yeah, for sure. So Kathy May has said here, I think you're right, read the order. This is when we were talking about whether race was central. So Kathy May says, I think you're right, read the order that snags people, Cheryl, but LGBT plus has been co-opted commercially in ways that race hasn't, in my opinion. This is an excellent conversation. Anything you want to add on to that, Mac? Thanks, Kathy May, for that.
I don't know. It'd be great to kind of dig into that like co-opted dynamic because I
Yeah.
think race has, but it's a little bit more subtle. So when you've got organisations that spend all this money and kind of position themselves as inclusive through their advertising or marketing, and then you look at how they're structured internally, and there's kind of no progress, or there's been no progress in 10 or 15 years. You've
Yeah.
also got, I'm not sure if you saw the Pepsi advert, can't remember how many years ago it was now, probably like 5 or 6, where Kylie Jenner
Yeah.
was positioned to solve racial inequality with
Yeah.
just giving a Pepsi to a police officer, and everyone all of a sudden, the deals of the world
Yeah.
are fixed from a racial equality perspective.
Yeah.
So I think there are kind of dynamics where I do see the struggle for racial equality being co-opted and being commercialized and being trivialized to some extent.
Yeah.
But I do agree that it has been done a lot more visibly, I think, in the LGBTQ plus dynamic with, the rainbow badges and organizations
Yeah.
creating logos that are kind of rainbow-esque,
Yeah.
as a means to say that, there's no issues here with the LGBTQ plus community, when that absolutely isn't people's day-to-day experience.
Yeah. And within the LGBTQ plus community, there's almost like a whole subset of challenges and discrimination as well within that community. So it
Mm.
is quite complex. And then around the conversation in terms of data, Joanne was saying data allows you to look at some uncomfortable truths that are evidence based, and that's the thing, isn't it? Because a lot of these conversations can be quite uncomfortable, and so actually, as Mac was saying, the data helps to kind of almost just take the emotion out of it because the data is quite objective, and it's like this is what the data is telling us. A comment here from Sophia Mack. Thanks for being at the fore of this. Absolutely. Data helps confirm and address the skeptics. And then Joanne said, I think coming back to when we were having the conversation about the social identity, it's why I'm doing my doctorate on privilege. I tell you, that sounds so interesting, a doctorate on privilege. And actually, I don't know whether it was as Joanne was writing this or just before, but when Mac, when you were talking about leaders that have been in these roles for say 10, 20, 30 years, and maybe I've only ever seen leaders that look like them.
Mm.
you know there is something, and I know the word privilege sometimes kind of gets people's back up. The word that sprang to me actually was the default, that you kind of go through life being the default, right? And it's how you are sort of like woken up to the fact that actually there are other identities that go through a different lived experience to you. One more comment, and then we're going to get into the question of how to choose and how to sort of like know what to look for. No shade, I promise. DEI, dealing with essential. Dealing with essential. One, emotional intelligence enables transformation to become sustainable. Need parts 2, 3, and 4. Love the conversation. Yeah. Parts 2, 3, and 4. I assume she's meaning in terms of this conversation. Absolutely. Let's get into. So we talked about how to find out what the organisation needs. I had the one question, which was how to know if the organisation is ready. Is the organisation ready for it? What are your you must have gone into organisations, Mac, and you're thinking they've called me in here. This organisation is not ready. how should internally? How does the organisation know if they're ready for these sorts of conversations?
I mean, it really depends on the intervention. I think, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, but I think every organization should be ready to understand their data and to hear people's experiences. Um, and I guess one of the things that I've seen is that often it can prompt you to become ready. So I think there's organizations that would, if they were allowed to, just say, we're not ready, we're not ready, we're not ready, we're not ready, we're not ready. And that might be true when it comes down to existential crises. So if an organization is not sure whether they're going to exist in a year's time, then that's probably the wrong time to start to invest heavily in diversity and inclusion. But for the most part, the organisations we deal with aren't in that boat. I think there's something to be said about kind of the emotional intelligence, but also organizational intelligence of the leadership team. So making sure that they individually are ready. And I think that speaks to a larger question in terms of what do we demand from leaders? You know, what characteristics must leaders have when taking up leadership? And I think in certain organizations, leadership is seen as just being a safe pair of hands and just steadying the ship, where I believe that actually for diversity and inclusion to thrive, it needs to be a leader that is willing to take risks, and a leader that's willing to lead in a way that is transformational. Because a lot of this work is transformational. A lot of this work does require you to dig deep and demand a different level of leadership from those that you have around the table. And I think only certain people have really got the gut for it. I say that to say, I think most organisations with the right leadership will be ready, and that's a really sneaky way of saying that a lot of organisations, if they feel they're not ready, probably don't have the right leadership.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I was gonna, as you were talking, I was gonna go to the leadership in terms of, and I always sort of say, I'm happy to work with any organisation as long as the will is there, if that makes sense, and that has to come from the top. So however early on the organisation is in the journey, as long as there is the will to make that transformational change, and I'm happy to go there. But you're absolutely right, Mac. I think in terms of if the leadership is not willing, and it usually starts with, say for example, the CEO or somebody close to the CEO, and if they're not ready to get on that bus, then I wouldn't bother getting on, because I'm not sure it's going to be going anywhere very fast. That's based
Yeah.
on my experience.
I think it's also there's a brilliant quote that I read the other day, which I wish I had to hand, because I'm probably going to butcher it, but it was essentially saying that you every opportunity to change starts with now, and it starts from, you can only change from where you are currently. I think sometimes there's a perception that, when I get to A, or when I get to B, or when I get to C, I will then be ready for change.
Yeah,
But we have to be conscious of the fact that every situation that we want to improve starts with a realization that we're in the situation that we're in, and we can
yeah,
only move from there. There's no point, trying to conceive a better time to do this or a better
yeah,
circumstance.
yeah,
We have to deal with the reality of the situation that we're
yeah.
in.
Exactly. We have to start now. So just picking up on Catherine May's point, PhD, brilliant. I like that PhD. Honestly, I wouldn't mind signing up for that myself. Picking out the complexity and the opportunism into co-option and commercialism, and you're both right. Is the co-option changing the boardroom composition, the decision making, and the narrative and beliefs? Very, very deep. Um, Sophia, absolutely. I think this was talking about the leadership and transformational leadership being brought in terms of organisations' readiness. Am I planning a DEI online summit? I wasn't. Possibly. Yeah, really interesting. So, in terms of Sophia, I need to get you on here first. That's for sure. You're on my list. Before we go, because I am conscious of your time, Mac, and I know that you've got lots to do today. And I did say that we weren't going to do any shade. There's going to be no shade at all. Um,
I think you promised that. I didn't promise that.
So, what should, just in terms, we talked about the different types of consultancy. We talked about how to figure out what your need is. What do you want to look for in a consultant? So, in terms of, what's the benchmark? What are some of the things that you should look for, and how you go about engaging and onboarding a D&I consultancy?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of it comes down to fit. So you, as an organization, need to find the type of company that will fit with the way that you want to do things. And I say that slightly hesitantly because, again, as we've discussed on this call, like, this work isn't necessarily comfortable. So it's not necessarily about an organisation to partner with that will make you comfortable. And I think there's a lot of, and this is probably a conversation for another day, but there's a lot of, I don't think I can give this answer without throwing a little bit of shade. But there's a lot of pandering, and there's a lot of like, I'm really struggling to
Just
not.
spit it out, Mac. Mac's
Yeah,
trying not to be shady. That's why.
I really am. But there's, we see all sorts of kind of accreditations and companies that will like pat you on the back and give you an award for um, just having some policies and you know writing a cool narrative about how inclusive you are, where the reality is starkly different. So this is not about, for me, this is not necessarily about going out and finding an organisation that's gonna pat you on the back and make you feel good about where you are. It's about going for an organisation that's going to have the, I guess I'd term it in organizational intelligence, to
Yeah,
really understand the type of organization you are, what you need, how things need to be positioned, how things need to be
mm,
pitched. And we as a company try to take our time to really deeply understand our clients, to really deeply understand the situations they're in, even what we're talking about leadership comfort and leadership um, ability to really deal with some of this stuff. I think that's
yeah,
the information that we try to collect, first and foremost, just to understand how difficult or how easy is this going to be for us in terms of taking you on that journey.
yeah,
And once we've got that understanding for where you are as an organization, we can then tailor an offering that really kind of wraps around where you are, because there's no point us coming in trying to do X, Y, and Z and you're absolutely not ready for it.
yeah,
So for me, it was all about that fit in terms of how well can the consultancy or consultant understand where you are and understand what you need. And I think that speaks to a wider skill set. The difficulty, I think, in this space is that we've got a lot of activists that don't necessarily have the underlying understanding of how organizations work and what the potential politics are at play, what the different dynamics are when thinking about the boardroom, or also when thinking about the commercial aspects of it. So how does this impact, or how does work potentially impact the bottom line? How does it work in terms of existing contracts, existing ways of working that need to be changed or altered in order for this to fully fit in?
yeah. You know what? There's quite a lot there to unpack. But interestingly, first of all, what you said in terms of the fit. What sprang to mind for me was that this really has to be very much right sized and almost like tailor made for each organization, because as much as
Mm,
there may be like a standard approach or a standard framework to how the work is done and how things are done, but the the answer or the interventions cannot be cookie cutter. And I think if
absolutely.
you have a consultancy coming to you almost with a slide deck that's find and replace, right? Which we've both worked for the big four, right? This is no shade, right? But we know that sometimes you get consultancies that literally turn up and they've almost done a find and replace of the client name.
Mm,
And sort of, it's almost that no shade, honestly, to the big four. We love them. But and it's not just
I'm
big
feeling a lot of shade, but
and it's not just the big four. Lots of organizations do this. It's just, and it almost does then just become a tick box, actually, because it's so, as I say, it's cookie cutter. um, and certainly my experience, especially some of the challenges that we've been talking about, some of the complexities, there's no way this could be cookie cutter. Not least because of the you've got the individuals in the senior leadership team and what will work for where they are, but then you've also got, linking back to the question about the data and where the organization is, and some of the comments that Kathy May was making, those complexities about the intersectionality and what
mm,
the needs are of the organization. It's so just not a one size fits all. There's a really, really important question that's coming in from Sophia, which is, what is shade? Which I love.
I don't know. I've never experienced shade.
Shade as in like to throw shade, I think, as the Gen Zs would put it, as in to speak disparagingly of. So So what
I
I
love
said,
that.
Sophia, on this session is that you know, obviously we're not here to kind of like throw stones at any other D&I consultants. I guess we're here really to make sure that organizations make really good choices. You know, there's a saying, isn't there? There's a somebody for everybody,
Hmm.
um, and there are lots of D&I consultants, you know, out there doing lots of good work, and you know, there will be a need somewhere probably for that work. But it's making sure that as Mac was saying, was like the fit is right in terms of what's the need, what's the service that's being offered, does the approach work, does the style work, and all of that stuff to make sure that the outcome is good for both. And then there was something else that you said. So you talked about fit. Yeah, and we talked about the tick box stuff as well. How that's not. Oh yeah, the tick box in terms of these organisations that maybe come along and say, "Oh, we've got this accreditation," and you do. I had a client that approached me the once and sort of said, "Oh yeah, we want to do this," and I was like, "Yeah." It's not my bag. It's just, and I just sort of said, you know, I'm not sure that's giving you the value that you think it's going to bring you, you know. So I was quite diplomatic, but I said no, I really don't think it's going to give you the value. So I'm clearly in the dark ages. No, it's fine. I have an advantage in that I guess I have a Gen Z daughter, so she kind of keeps me slightly with it, and Max, you know, quite young anyway, so he has an advantage in terms of
I'll take that.
areas. The other things in terms of what people should be looking for with consultancy, I think you touched on it actually in terms of the skill. So sometimes I think there's probably some people out there that have the will, but not necessarily the skill in all of the areas. So it's interesting. We're talking about D&I consultancy. When you think of consultancy, actually there is a skill around consulting, which is,
Mm.
you know, as I think you said earlier in the conversation, it's like, you know, it is, you know, can you go into a situation and really understand the problem and come up with solutions and facilitate and engage and all of those sorts of things. And when we talked about the different types of consultancy, and we talked about people that maybe focus on an area, particular characteristic. So, say for example, you know, it could be LGBTQ awareness or disability inclusion, and actually what's being offered there may be more of like awareness training, but
Mhm.
less, you know, sort of almost like that holistic consultancy around, you know, what are the policies, practices, processes. So it's just making sure that there's not a mismatch between like the need, the expectation, and then what's delivered, because then that's when people are like, oh, you know, that consultants weren't that good. And it's not necessarily that they're not good, it's just that the fit wasn't there actually for what was needed.
I
A
think
direct,
there's also something to be said there about expectations as well, because I think sometimes people have unrealistic expectations that, you know, if we do this one piece of training, you know, we're no longer going to have diversity and inclusion issues, which is
yeah,
um, quite a weird expectation to have.
yeah,
But I think there's also something to be said about the type of organisation you work with. To say, and I think we were probably better at this in the earlier days of our existence, where we wouldn't do standalone training. We absolutely turned down um, quite a few projects and what quite a few requests to come in and do training, because we firmly believe that training on its own is not going to make a fundamental difference. There has to
yeah,
be training as part of a greater strategy to really
yeah,
resolve issues over the long term. So I
yeah,
think the onus sometimes is also on the consultancy to set you know, realistic expectations in terms of what the
yeah.
outcomes will be.
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, the consultants are the experts. So the person that's engaging the consultants, obviously, you know, will have a level of understanding of their organization and, you know, what the need is to a degree. But obviously the consultants are the ones that should be bringing that expertise in, so
Mm.
should be able to kind of help with that understanding of what will be achieved by doing what and actually what won't be, and being completely upfront about that and not promising the earth. Couple of questions from Sophia. First of all, one, Mac, in terms of whether you work with charities, and then second of all, but I might just get Sophia to clarify this one. So the second question is there a difference in transformation and the type of organization? So I'm wondering if that back to the charity question, actually. I think maybe that's clear. I think the question that you're asking there, Sophia, is whether um, the type of transformation will be different depending on the type of organization. I mean, I know that for me, because I've worked with in not for profit and for profit, and some of the challenges are the same, if not harder, sometimes in the not for profit sector for all sorts of other reasons.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that, Matt?
I'd agree with that. Yeah, so we do quite a significant amount of work with charities, and the issue with charities sometimes is that they have this default kind of self-reflection that they're all good,
Yeah,
and that goodness or niceness stops them from really owning the toxic things that happen in those charities. So
yeah,
if you've got an overarching purpose and goal that you're working towards, that purpose can kind of be taken as an excuse, taken as kind of a, yeah, I guess an excuse to say
yeah,
that we're not necessarily focused on other things, or we're not necessarily focused on, addressing racism or addressing misogyny, or any of the other issues that happen in an organisation.
yeah,
And there's often a tendency to hide behind this greater purpose. So if we're working with kids in kind of third world countries, quote unquote third world countries, um, as long as we do that, we can't possibly be racist, or we can't possibly have
yeah.
systemic issues, and that's couldn't be further from the truth.
And I'd also add on to that as well, Sophia, because this is something that I've come across um, quite recently with a client, is where you've got organizations where actually as part of almost like their core structure of getting things done or decision making, they rely on more volunteers. So more volunteers and or more individuals that are no longer sort of like in the world of work, if that makes sense. there
Mm,
is there is a potential risk that they are a little bit more detached from things like just really basic like equalities act, discrimination law, and all of that sort of thing. So actually sometimes you even see more horrific things actually because it's just lay people trying to help the organization get things done. So potentially there's actually even a bigger risk, um, in terms of some of those challenges. Right. So final question then. Did we talk about how to engage and on board? And just any final tips really, because I'm conscious of your time. We've gone way over, but this conversation was just so interesting. And now Kathy May's just written a final point for us as well. But Mac, any final questions, comments, or points from you?
Um, I think for me, it'd be about really just understanding who you are as an organisation and the type of work that you need. I would also potentially advise organizations to look at the long term. So we as an organization try to work with companies over a long term basis, because this work takes time. There's no expectation that you'll have a consultant come in for 1 month and things will be sorted. So we generally invest years in our relationships with organizations. So some of the case studies or success stories I talked about earlier are organizations we've been working with for like 2, 3, 4 years. So I think be prepared to go on that journey with an organisation for the long haul.
Yeah,
I think I would add to that the context of the last couple of years is that we've had kind of an influx of diversity inclusion consultancies, and I'm not certain of the longevity of some of them without throwing shade. But it'd be interesting to really understand what this work looks like over the long term, and just making sure that you're equipped and prepared to go on that journey.
yeah. And I think, the key there, you said equipped and ready to go on that journey. And it kind of links into Kathy May's point here, which is around, the missing link often seems to be the follow through to support the organisation to make the changes in an ongoing way with built in pauses for reflection and learning. The challenge for consultancy is that they sometimes leave without the coaching or embedding an organisational culture of change that is owned at the highest level. So most definitely, and Sophia was agreeing with that as well. Because the other thing I was going to say actually that good consultants do really well, and when I think about like bigger transformation stuff that I've done back in the day, one of the things that really good consultants do is they embed the capability before they go. So they embed the capability. So like you were saying, you built up like a longer term relationship with an organization, and you actually start to embed that capability and embed those habits and those practices, and you hopefully then have internal people that can continue with maybe a lighter touch kind of advisory support and some interventions along the way, but you want it done in a way that's absolutely sustainable, where the organization doesn't have to be shelling out you know tens and hundreds of thousands each year, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that I often reflect on as success stories as well. So where we've worked with an organization and, you know, years later they've come back to me and said, I saw something and I challenged it, and I was only able to challenge it because of the work that we did. And so many of those that I don't think they're great anecdotes to share in a forum like this, but those are the ones that really stand out to me in terms of knowing that we've made a difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. Perfect. Embed the capability. Love that. Is the only way. It really is. We're going to wrap things up because this 30-minute live has gone on for like nearly double the time. So, Mac, you know what that means? That means I'm going to have to get you back on at some point to have a follow-up conversation. Maybe the follow-up conversation will be the shade. The shade borough. The shade borough, Sophia. I think I'm going to say it's like a website where people go on and throw shade willy and indeed nilly. So, Mac, thank you so much. Where can people find you, Mac, and find out more about you?
So I'm sometimes on LinkedIn, sometimes. I guess that we're at the Equal Group everywhere on social media, www.theequalgroup.com. Sign up to the newsletter. We provide great insights on a bi-weekly basis. And yeah, just social media generally. You won't personally find me because I'm not great at social media, but one of the team will be there.
I thought you said you were going to start doing LinkedIn more, Mac. I'm sure you will be.
I'm taking it back. I'm thinking about the commitment that's needed. I'm not sure. Right. 2 minutes into it, Joanne was demanding.
Absolutely. Where's next week's post? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Safia has put comment. Great discussions. Thank you, Safia, for joining. Yeah, absolutely. No, this has been absolutely brilliant. And what, in terms of the Equal Group, what's currently on for you? What can people see you coming up with next? What big things have you got coming?
It's a good question. So I guess a lot of our work is kind of long-term relationships with clients. We've got some great initiatives that we are partnering with organisations on. I guess in the longer term, we're going to be focused more on impact. So hopefully we'll be able to share a little bit more around what that means, what that looks like, and the frameworks that we're going to be using going forward. But for the time being, it's kind of just embedding into the clients that we're currently working with. Always on the lookout for new clients to develop long-term relationships with as well.
I'd love to see the Equal Group doing some white papers or something. I'd love that. That's just a request from me, personal request.
If you're willing to sponsor it, then we're willing to provide. So.
Absolutely. That's it. Thank you so much for joining, everybody, and thank you for your questions and comments. Some really deep level of insight, and possibly will also shape some future conversations. Sophia, I genuinely can't wait to get you on here. I will be in touch. I'll be in touch. We'll get that DEI online conference sorted out, right? Perfect. Mac, thank you again. Have an amazing day, an amazing weekend.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
And thank you, everybody, for joining. I'll see you again next week, back onto my regular day, which is a Friday. However, if a Thursday works better for people, let me know. But if I don't hear anything, I'll be back next Friday. So thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks a lot.